Hey everyone, I want to welcome you back to a Q&A here with Murray. And before we get into some questions, Murray, I'd like for you to recap Sunday's sermon.
Sure. This past Sunday, we talked about Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the real question that we wrestled with is, how do we love others when everything in our culture is about providing for ourselves? And Jesus speaks into that by telling a story about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about how one unlikely person providing care for a man in desperate need provides a way for us not only to know how to be a neighbor, but also how to see Christ's work in the midst of that.
So often when we heard that story, even growing up through childhood, we usually find ourselves thinking, I'm the Good Samaritan. But how, when we actually apply that we are the man who was beaten, how when we associate ourselves with him, does that actually help us become a better neighbor?
It's a good application to say we ought to be the Good Samaritan, but if we only take that away, then we're taking away a legalistic interpretation of that passage. Every biblical text requires us to ask the question, with whom are we meant to identify? And in this particular text, we're not so much meant to identify with the Good Samaritan, but rather with the traveler who is stripped and beaten, and in a sense, his physical poverty represents our spiritual poverty. And when we understand that Christ, who is the true neighbor, rescued us in our spiritual poverty, then that provides the motivation and enablement, the strength, in other words, to be good Samaritans to other people.
Yeah. And last night, which was wonderful, by the way, when we had a little Q&A with our men's gathering, one of the questions brought up was, what are things, when we're being neighborly and loving people, what are things sometimes that we miss that we are doing already in our lives that we're not associating with, this is how I'm serving my neighbor?
I think we typically think of Christian acts of service ought to be grand slam hits of ministry. And we often overlook the things that we might deem unimportant, but God doesn't say are unimportant. The first thing that we identified last night was prayer. God calls his people to pray. And when we call on the Lord of the universe, he tells us in his sovereign plan, he chooses either to act according to our prayers or not. But whether or not he does, we're still calling the Lord to action. And so I think praying for our neighbors, telling them that we're praying for them, taking time to actually pray with them. So that's one. And then the other one is just simple deeds of love and mercy that are evidence of a heart that has received love and mercy from Christ.
I got one more question. The lawyer, it says, he's kind of quick to justify himself.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we sometimes quick to justify ourselves? And how can we protect our hearts from wanting to justify ourselves by that being the motivation in which we serve neighbors?
Well, I think the reason that we want to justify ourselves is because we struggle with the reality that we don't love God and our neighbors as we ought. And that's a tough thing to grapple with. But the gospel is big enough for us to have the ability not only to do right things through Christ, but also to confess when we don't. And so the gospel gives us the freedom to say, I haven't loved the Lord with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my strength, and I haven't loved my neighbor as myself. And Lord, I want you to give me a heart like your heart that loves others. And there's power in confession there.
Well, we thank you for, again, your word yesterday.
Sure.
We thank you for just supporting Kava Park, for listening to these Q&As. If you ever have any more questions that we don't cover on this podcast, feel free to email me or Murray, and we will answer those as we can. But thank you, and we will see you next week.